ready to start with Dr. Tom Stees and Dr. Peter Stein. So.
Yeah, thank you. What we'd like to do today is provide kind of a high-level overview of some of the key findings from the synthesis. There's a lot of material in there. Obviously, we can't cover it in great detail in 30 or 40 minutes that we're going to take here. I'm going to kind of lead the charge, and then I'd ask Peter to chime in after each chapter, kind of go through each chapter, and things that I either get wrong or forget. Peter, hope you chime in and correct the thing or add information to what we're talking about.
Yeah, so, we'll do.
Yeah, great. So, the purpose of the synthesis was to provide existing science, to provide managers with a scientific foundation for the assessment and plan revision, and also just general management in general. So we saw our charge certainly came from the motivation around plan revision, but we think it's a much broader application than just plan revision. The status, where is it? Well, the synthesis has been publicly released. The process for generating the synthesis was pretty involved and took us a couple of years for various reasons. It was deemed highly influential science, which is a category under the OMB standards for government science. That required rigorous peer review and transparency. That required us to have some public input into the draft, which was a year and a half ago or so released, and then a revision was done after that. We engaged with the Ecological Society of America to run the peer review, so we had arm's length and give the reviewers an independent forum for reviewing it. It's what started as maybe one volume and concise turned into 3 volumes and not so concise. But that was a function of partly the questions and the volume of science that exists. We've looked at over 4,000 documents that were cited. That doesn't include many documents that weren't cited but were examined as well. We have executive summaries, however, and they'll be coming out soon in a published form. There was a rollout, a science forum rollout on June 26th. To the public and a webcast, and there were folks in the audience and some questions from outside the room. The electronic copies are now available on the PNW website. Hard copies are coming out later this summer. And what we're doing now is kicking off the tech transfer part, so engaging with the folks who will pick up the ball and go ahead with the bioregional assessment.
Yeah, Tom, let me...
Yeah. Sure, Peter.
Okay. We struggled, as Tom said, with the length of this document. It was our intention to make it concise as possible, but keep in mind that this summary tries to encapsulate what is presented in over 4,000 different publications, as Tom said, and our best efforts to try to keep it short. We still kept it as short as we could. In particular, after we got the peer review feedback from the peer review team, which we'll talk about maybe a little bit more in a minute, added more length to this document. So bear with us. I mean, the synthesis is, I think, around 1,200 pages in 3 volumes. Which sounds daunting. Even the executive summary is, I believe, almost 200 pages. But how do you encapsulate all this information on all these topics and still be brief? Trust me, we did our best to keep it as short as possible, but we didn't want to leave important things out. So I just wanted to add a little bit of detail to that topic, because as you read through it, I'm sure you'll be somewhat overwhelmed by the volume of information in there.
Yeah, that's an important point. I think we got the questions from the managers that set up an initial draft, and then went after peer review to scientists, and the scientists often had their own opinions about what was missing. And so that added, in some cases, 25 or 30% to the volumes of some of these chapters. So Yeah, it's a big job. I don't, maybe some people will read it from cover to cover. I don't know if you do it in one sitting, but we hopefully, well, it is searchable. So that's the way to really attack this, as a reference document, and look for keywords and topics that you might be interested in. So again, the questions from the managers got it going. It was framed around the original Northwest Forest Plan goals and strategies, although it was not in contrast to the monitoring reports and the 10-year science synthesis report. This is not so much a really focused referendum on the Northwest Forest Plan up or down, but it was more of a focus of, here are some goals and questions related to those goals. Those goals are related to the Northwest Forest Plan, but this document is not necessarily just a evaluation of the Northwest Forest Plan as well as in terms of how well it's worked or not, although in many cases some of the chapters go into what's worked and what hasn't, but it's not like some of the early documents on the Northwest Forest Plan. The other thing, of course, is that there are many new issues that have popped up since 1993 when the Northwest Forest Plan was put together. Of course, big ones are climate change. Northwest Forest Plan focused strongly on old growth forests, but there's other successional stages out there. Social processes have expanded in terms of the focus of management, socioeconomic changes, and there's a significant policy change in the 2012 planning rule. And that really sets a different context for the Northwest Forest Plan. The 2008, or no, what was the 94 planning rule, the one that guided the Northwest Forest Plan, had a strong imprint on the focus on viability of many species. And so we have a new planning rule, and that really changes the context for the Northwest Forest Plan. So the first chapter was a climate change chapter led by Matt Riley and others. The goal here was mainly to present sort of fundamental material related to climate change, and but not exclusively in this chapter. In other words, where there's climate change effects on fish or wildlife, those are dealt with in the individual chapters. Otherwise, this chapter would be really large if it had to deal with all of that. So this provides sort of a foundation or a floor for what is climate change, what are the sources, what are the trends in the climate, different measures that set up things. And so what we know, of course, is this Pacific Northwest region and Northern California have always been climatically dynamic. And so the historical record on climate is quite clear. It's not been a static climate, and we're in a period of change again. The key vulnerabilities identified in this chapter relate to wildfire, of course, and insects, and you're probably familiar with what those might be, and species that occur at high elevations where their range is really, they have no place to run because they're at the top of the mountain and things are warming up and the snowpacks are disappearing. This chapter goes into sort of an overview of some of the adaptations that managers could make to dealing with climate change, given goals for species and ecosystems, and these include using thinning and prescribed fire to reduce densities and increase resilience to drought, recognizing that old growth, multi-storied old growth forests actually are microclimate refugia on the landscape, and so provide places where species can hang out on hot days like today. Landscape connectivity. The Northwest Forest Plan, of course, had a big landscape component to it. It's a regional plan. It was all about trying to reestablish connectivity, and so adaptation in general to climate change, I think, the Northwest Forest Plan fits fairly well with that general type of recommendation. And then invasive species. These have really popped up quite a bit more than in the early days of the Northwest Forest Plan. And so, of course, the big one is the barred owl, and we'll talk more about that. But invasive species require their own level of management activity and focus. And then mitigation is really about the feedback to the climate system and trying to find ways to increase carbon storage on the landscape. And so we cover a lot in there about the fact that older forests have store a lot more carbon than young forests, although young forests can more rapidly soak up carbon. And that depending on the scale and where you are, fire hazard reduction may have a positive or a negative effect on carbon on the landscape. And there's some competing science on that, and we talk about that, where the science supports fuel treatments as a way to mitigate carbon loss, and where fuel treatments may actually lead to increased carbon loss. So that's one of these areas of some controversy in the literature. Peter, do you have any other comments on this one?
Just very quickly, we should emphasize that there's a lot of variability in both the projections and the implications for site-specific response. So while it's easy to fall into the trap of trying to generalize the expected impact of climate change, be careful to understand that it's quite variable on the landscape given topographic conditions and other conditions, east versus west, north versus south. There's a lot of variability, so be careful not to fall into generalization traps.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, and that's a challenge because everyone sort of views the Northwest Forest Plan as this one big thing, but it's dealing with a highly diverse landscape. The vegetation and disturbance chapter, which I was the lead on, looked, first of all, sort of set the stage in terms of old growth and recognizing that all old growth is not the same. Certainly huge differences between what we call the moist and dry forests, east side, west side. Often we use those terms, but there's a big difference between Northern California and further up north in Western Oregon and Washington that needs to be taken into account. There's also major differences in the disturbance regimes that we address in this chapter. We also take on the issue that although the Northwest Forest Plan certainly was motivated originally by concerns about logging and loss of old growth, that today there's a much broader appreciation that old growth is only one stage and one part of a forest conservation strategy. There are other stages, in particular early successional post-fire stages, that people are concerned about. We identify ecological values associated with those and in which types of disturbance regimes those occur in. We talk about fire suppression in dry and moist forests. Of course, fire suppression is well known to anyone in the Forest Service and is often associated, as rightly so, with the dry forests. But we've identified some cases where the so-called moist forests, particularly in the southern part of Western Oregon, where the fire suppression has had an effect, a different type of an effect on landscape and biodiversity. Vegetation and disturbance continues with focus on what's the science behind restoration, and we find that there's a major support in the literature for restoration in fire-frequent forests. We were asked to also address some of the controversy associated with those, what we think is a minority of scientists who have alternative views of the need for restoration in dry forests, and we take that on head on in a couple places in this chapter, which also takes up a lot of space because anytime you're preparing papers, you really got to delve into things. But we think the overwhelming support is for restoration in dry forests. And some background or some context. I mean, restoration, not everyone is a fan of the term restoration. It kind of carries some baggage of its own. Are we trying to go back to what was the past? And of course, under the planning rule, resilience, managing for resilience, ecological integrity is maybe where more some of the emphasis is put. We talk about the role of history, acknowledge that history could be a guide, but we can't go back and recreate these landscapes. They're not coming back. The climate's changed, the landscape's changed. And then we identify some actions, particularly for the drier forests, through thinning, prescribed fire, and managed natural ignitions that could contribute to resilience to fire and climate change. The current pace is small relative to the need. And this is perhaps an area, because we had some difficulty getting implementation monitoring information about what has actually happened on the ground. It wasn't readily available. I know some of the implementation monitoring programs were not continued, and so perhaps this is something that needs a better documentation going forward. And then early seral and moist forests, this is the notion that many of our landscapes were not just a sea of old growth, but they had significant areas, in some cases 10 or 20% in early seral conditions, and with fire suppression those have been lost even in moist forests.
Hey, Tom, this is Peter.
Yeah.
when you went through your first slide for Chapter 3, I don't think the map showed up.
Yeah, the map didn't show up. I'm not sure
No,
what the
it didn't.
problem is here. The other map shows up.
Oh, yes, something's missing then.
Yeah, I was expecting to see my disturbance regime map. There's a disturbance regime map that should appear in this PowerPoint. And one of the significant things we did is we developed a new disturbance regime map for the whole Northwest Forest Plan area. And this is, I think, a significant and useful contribution. And it helps because a lot of the management recommendations, conservation guidelines, differ depending on what type of disturbance regime we're in. And so,
yeah, I wanted to add emphasis to that because when you look at the map, and it's in the publication, it really shows how different California is. And I want to point out this comment, especially for the Region 5 folks, because the Northwest Forest Plan, I believe, in both its landscape and its implementation, is quite a different animal when you get down into Southern Oregon and then, of course, California. And the disturbance regime map really illustrates that well. So, again, the variability in this 24 million acre landscape is tremendous, but there are some geographic regions that pop out to help sort of.
Right. Yeah. Thanks, Peter. That's an important point. I mean, we think that 40% of the Northwest Forest Plan area is in dry forest types, and you can break the dry forest types into two major disturbance regimes of really frequent sort of a ponderosa pine type where low severity fire was probably the dominant fire behavior, and then more of a mixed severity type where you can get some larger areas of high severity fire, but fires are still very frequent historically. And then within the moist type, there's the classic wet, Sitka spruce, western hemlock, western Olympic Peninsula type of forest or coast range. But then there's a sort of a drier Douglas fir, western hemlock type where fires were more frequent. And so we identify where those sort of approximate where those are on the landscape. And we hope that would be useful to bioregional assessment. So then the northern spotted owl, of course, the story from the monitoring is pretty clear and sobering that the populations have declined since the plan was implemented. Some of that decline, of course, was expected at the time of the Northwest Forest Plan, but the barred owl has accelerated that in many areas. And so the barred owl now has become a significant threat to the barred owl beyond the original threat, which was the logging. From a habitat standpoint, we've gone from habitat being lost primarily to logging to, in the last 20 years, wildfire being a primary source of habitat loss. In many parts of the Northwest Forest Plan area, particularly Northern California, Southern Oregon, the spotted owl is adapted to a landscape of fire where it uses nesting and roosting in refugia or areas that don't receive fire but often forages in the burned areas. So the fact that fire is occurring within spotted owl landscapes is something that is recognized as the owl being adapted to that, particularly where its prey base is different in Southern Oregon. Interestingly, fire exclusion in the dry forest is leading to more owl habitat than we had historically, which is maybe a surprise to some folks. But particularly in the eastern and western Cascades of Oregon and Washington, we have more spotted owl habitat than we had historically, and there's some data to support that conclusion. The outlook for the populations is not good, and there's a high uncertainty. We really tried to press the owl biologists on this, and of course, it was hard for them to be optimistic, but they didn't want to just throw in the towel as well either. So, they saw that the increased habitat protection was one way to deal with it, as well as control of barred owls. And so that involves conserving known and historical sites. The big challenge, I think, is going to be in the dry forests where landscape scale approaches may be needed to deal with dual goals of fire resilience and maintaining owl habitat and populations. So that's an area that I'll talk about that more later. Marbled murrelet, the conclusions here, the protections have helped. There's been a decline in populations in the northern part of the area. and some of that is linked to changes in habitat on the land. There's some pretty compelling information that shows where the populations are on the sea. They correspond pretty closely to where the habitat is on the landscape and vice versa. Habitat's been in decline, but is expected to increase. In fact, the only place that we found significant increases in old forest were in some of our Coast Range forests, like on the Siuslaw, where they have some age classes that are now moving into some of the conditions that might be supporting marbled murrelets. But the threats remain: loss of nesting habitat. There's a lot of interest in non-federal lands these days and what they might contribute to the marbled murrelet. But there's also recognition that nest depredation by jays and crows are critical, and so human activity, camping, edge effects have these more indirect effects on the populations of the species that may need to be taken into account. And of course, conditions in the marine environment play a big role too. Peter, any comments on the murrelet?
No, go ahead.
And the conclusion from the team is that the Northwest Forest Plan design is currently valid for recovery. Chapter 6, Bruce Marcoux and a host of folks dealt with this chapter. This is a very challenging chapter because unlike the owl and the marbled murrelet, this chapter had to deal with hundreds and hundreds of species. Obviously, we can't deal with those individually, but it was a challenge for Bruce to pull that together. But the Northwest Forest Plan had the survey managed protocols early on that surveyed for these rare and less well-known species that were on these lists. Those surveys, when they were conducted, almost always resulted, in fact, I think always resulted in a removal of species from a list once information became available. But that surveying was discontinued, and there's concern in this chapter that the lack of monitoring will make it difficult to address those species that remain on the list. There's been a definite decline in the harvest of old growth. The whole issue with Survey Managed was it was a mitigation sort of program, given that there was still some old growth logging that was still going to happen in the matrix lands. And of course, there's been no official policy change as far as I know, but in effect, there's been little or no old growth logging in the matrix for the last 10 or so years that I'm aware of. And so at least at one level, the threat to these species that was posed by logging of unreserved old growth may have declined, but this one of the challenges of writing this chapter is that do we talk about the Northwest Forest Plan as it was written, or as the Northwest Forest Plan as it's implemented? And that's two different things often, and a challenge to talk about in a planning context. Species of other successional stages are talked about somewhat briefly. There's a lot less known about them. There was no essentially program to look at early sterile species from a monitoring standpoint, so you can imagine there's not as much known about those species of those habitats. And there's a conclusion that climate change could justify reassessment of the Northwest Forest Plan conservation design. There's been one or two papers that have sort of looked regionally at biodiversity, climate change in the Northwest Forest Plan area, and we highlight those, but there's not a whole lot out there to really, from a hard empirical science standpoint, to sort of use to go forward with climate change effects on biodiversity in the area. Peter, any comments on those species?
No, I mean, just one quick one. I know the Fisher and the Martin are big issues in Region 5 and I presume in Region 6. There's not a whole lot covered in here on Fisher and Martin. There's probably way more literature that people will want to avail themselves with as they deal with Fisher and Martin issues. So it's just a kind of a cursory coverage of those species, albeit they're very important now in California.
Okay. Chapter 7, one of the largest chapters. Gordy and I were competing for the largest chapter, and I think I beat him by a few hundred words somewhere in there. But The aquatic chapter had a big task at hand. It had to cover aquatic and riparian ecosystems, and again, kind of not unlike the previous chapter, lots of different species, although a lot of it, of course, focused on salmonids and species that were at risk or threatened. This chapter goes into a discussion of the second potential tree height and concludes that it's not strongly supported. This is based on a paper that Gordy and Norm Johnson and others, a GTR that they published just a year or two before this came out. But that doesn't necessarily mean that, from an ecological standpoint, that the second tree height is not justified if you also consider other trade-offs such as connectivity and other functions that the tree height rule contributed to. So they talk about what's known about the riparian forest function and related to riparian buffers. There's a fair amount in there about what's known about management effects and the potential need for management through active restoration, particularly using dynamics and variability as a guide. The near riparian environment is very diverse from a vegetation standpoint. It's not all just historically large conifers. It often includes hardwoods, shrubs, gravel bars, all kinds of things. And so there's a fairly strong emphasis on the fact that just managing existing plantations is to maintain them is probably promoting a homogeneity that did not exist historically in many areas. The chapter also talks quite a bit about invasive species and what their threat might be now, and spends a fair amount of time talking about that the federal lands have limited capacity for recovery of many ESA-listed species, given the watershed issues and where these issues lie in the Northwest Forest Plan area. The chapter has a pretty big chunk on climate change as it relates to aquatic systems, and also, I think, a pretty big appendix on climate change that Gordy thinks he might even try to publish as a separate paper. But so there's a lot of background on climate change effects. And it seems to me that there's maybe more available in the literature on climate change effects on aquatic and riparian systems than there was on the terrestrial systems. So this chapter reflects that. But anyway, so some of the effects that we might anticipate would be higher summer water temperatures, decreased low flows, winter higher flows given more storms and quicker runoff. And then the aquatic conservation strategy is seen as a viable conservation strategy under climate change, but inevitably there'll be winners and losers, and it's just, you can't maximize everything, and that's what this chapter highlights.
One quick point besides, you mentioned it, Tom, but management of riparian areas, which I believe here to this point is pretty much avoided. I think there's a lot of evidence that management of riparian areas, including headwater streams, will be something to consider in the future to restore riparian function. These are very dynamic systems, and they don't really take to a static management approach.
Right. So, yeah. In terms of an assessment question, I could imagine saying, well, how much have we done in riparian areas? Where are those places, and how do they lie in terms of the environments and goals you might have for a watershed? Okay, switch gears. We had a number of socioeconomic chapters, social chapters. This is Susan Charnley. A key finding, which was also a finding from earlier science reports, was that the rural communities in the Northwest Forest Plan area are not alike. There's some that have made the jump from resource-based to amenity-based economies, and there's some that have not. That I think the ones that have not are the challenge. The other challenge might be the ones that have. What kind of actions could the agency undertake to kind of support those communities where recreation and other types of activities are important? Timber is still important. Federal forests contribute about 10% of the regional timber supply. This is where some win-win situations may arise, where goals of restoration and resilience, management for resilience could also contribute to local economies. But critically, particularly in the drier, less productive areas, the mills and contract workforce, if you don't have those, you can't really do restoration in the dry forests. And so that's something we emphasize in several places in the report. Continuing, the agency can promote community economic well-being through various ways related to recreation or fire management. Non-timber forest products, the authors felt that more attention could be paid to these, and they're more important in some areas than others. Recreation is a significant driver, but overnighting is the key to higher socioeconomic benefits as opposed to just driving up and jumping out of the car and taking a picture and moving on. So there was a feeling of what could be done to promote more overnighting. And then adaptation of local communities to wildfire, that has an economic impact and implications as well. Collaboration and public values, okay, that's the big social issue in federal land management these days. And this chapter, when Lee Cervani wrote this chapter, she said, well, you know, there's just not a lot in the literature. And we said, well, if it's not a lot of examples from the Pacific Northwest, just pull from wherever you can get it. So, you know, where we don't have a lot of concrete studies, a lot of these chapters draw from the larger literature and more theory or studies in other areas. And this chapter is one of those. I mean, certainly there are more than there used to be in terms of local studies, but there's a big need to learn more about the effectiveness of collaboration here. So public support for alternative harvest strategies that do not involve clear-cutting of old growth is just not there. I mean, in other words, the public does not want to see old growth harvested in the future. Engaging people in stewardship is important. There's symbolic meanings and emotional ties to places that are maybe overlooked if we just look at things in terms of more of a bottom line in terms of ecosystem services, just as sort of a spreadsheet. And cultural ecosystem services can be in a framework for identifying where those emotional ties and special places occur. Process of engagement, it's important. There's a lot of sort of best practices types of information in this chapter about ways that work for collaboration and ways that don't work, and you can imagine what those are. Collaboration often is used inconsistently and is often in conflicting expectations. And so it's important that this chapter goes into ways that help ensure that participants know what they're getting into and know what the expectations are, and also recognize that collaboration is not always the answer. Environmental justice deals with minority and populations that just are socioeconomically disadvantaged. They're growing in the area. The forestry workforce of Latinos is increasing. And agencies can often have an effect on the working conditions of those workers. And this chapter outlines ways that the agency could pay more attention to working conditions and practices, policies that might help in that regard. Non-timber forest products are often not well managed or not considered in management. And for the most part, EJ populations are underrepresented in recreation. But again, this, like a lot of the social chapters, there's just not a lot of local information about what's going on the ground, and that's a real challenge for managing the people side of the equation. Tribal values, Jonathan Long. Peter, do you have any comments on the environmental justice chapter?
No.
Okay. Jonathan Long headed up the tribal values chapter. Often the concerns were access and protection of tribal resources. There's certainly a strong influence of American Indians on historical fire regimes through much of the Northwest Forest Plan area, and today tribes are often interested in resources that are dependent on fire. So there's an intersection here of fire management and cultural ecosystem services. through active management, like prescribed fire, or things that would promote ecocultural resources. And of course, tribes are often interested in engagement in decision-making around areas that they either control or used to control but don't have a whole lot of control over anymore. The last chapter was in our attempt to sort of take all the individual chapters that were relatively narrowly focused and look at some of the interactions between them, things that might fall between the cracks. And so to some degree it's a summary of things I've mentioned, but it also highlights some other important dimensions. One is that the capacity to restore and manage for ecological resilience really depends on the social system. And this was maybe not as well appreciated at the time of the original Northwest Forest Plan, but it's clearly visible now. There's conflicting values and trust around doing that. And as I mentioned earlier, having a mill and workforce to be able to do restoration is essential. Without that, all of this restoration, particularly on the east side, just doesn't happen. And there's a big concern, and we talked about agency capacity in terms of numbers of positions, planning teams that, as you all know, have declined over the years. So the idea of ramping up restoration or management for resilience is often limited by the capacity of the agency. We state that quite clearly. We also state that restoration can contribute to the local economies and that the capacity of federal lands is good but limited to do a lot of this. So partnerships will be needed to try to undertake some of these things. And there'll be trade-offs. We point out that if you're managing for early successional, that might mean that you have to reduce late successional in some cases or other stages. Or if you're trying to emphasize protection of remnant old-growth forests, you might need to do fire protection, fire suppression that reduces the spread of a fire that could create some diverse early sorrel. Or if you're thinning, that's going to promote some wildlife species and have detrimental effects on others. And so we have in this chapter a very large table that identifies sort of general trade-offs associated with almost every action, whether you're managing for carbon, managing for early successional species, late successional species, it's always some sort of a trade-off. And putting together that chapter was a challenge, partly because the literature is often missing, but I think the greater challenges on the management side is how to deal with or what to do with those trade-offs. The uncertainties are large. Adaptive management, particularly at a landscape scale, we think is still a critical way to go, even though most of the formal adaptive management practices have been eliminated, or that program pretty much no longer exists. So I think that's, I got a couple other bonus points here. One is sort of a motivation for regional scale perspectives. This is a question that popped up, from the managers. And one is you can't treat the Northwest Forest Plan as a homogeneous area. It's ecologically variable. So that needs to be taken into account as this map of forest vegetation zones indicates. So there's definitely needs to be a regional scale perspective. There's populations that cross political boundaries, cross ecological boundaries, so that requires a regional perspective. There's climate change strategies that differ depending on where you are in the region, and so that requires some regional perspective and regional stratification. And finally, there's just the limitations of the federal lands for conservation. And this is pointed out particularly in the aquatic chapter, in the marbled mirrelet chapter, where those species aren't necessarily provided for in their best habitat on federal lands. The other issue that popped up from several management questions was the whole notion of dynamic versus static reserves. And so we have a fair amount in both the vegetation chapter and the integration chapter on what the science is on reserves, what it says about reserves and dynamic landscapes. And first of all, there's a strong support in the conservation literature for reserves as a way to conserve biodiversity. There's nobody saying we shouldn't have reserves, but there's also strong support in the scientific literature for the idea that active management may be needed in reserves depending on your ecological objectives. So this somewhat counters just sort of a knee-jerk reaction that a reserve is a place where no management happens and humans are kept out. That's clearly not what the opinion is in the scientific literature, and we document that as much as we can. Now, what happens when a part of an LSR burns up, or there's a question about, well, should we move that LSR? Well, the literature has support for the notion that that if a reserve is blown down, burned up, or overrun by something, you might consider moving it, and that's often in the case of small reserves, a few hundred acres, a few thousand acres. We couldn't find any examples in the literature where that has happened or been reported. It may have happened, but it's never been reported. So the idea of moving reserves, adjusting boundaries, is probably viable theoretically for small reserves. For larger reserves where the LSR is 50,000 or more acres and takes up a big chunk of a landscape, it's hard to imagine how you'd move that LSR because there's not a lot of places to go. So an alternative way of thinking about the reserve system for the large LSRs would be sort of as a dynamic ecosystem reserve where you have goals for, say, species like the spotted owl, but you also have goals for fire processes and other things that are part of the suite of goals under the planning rule. And so, but we have a fair amount of information about how to think about reserves, how other folks are thinking about reserves, what are some of the controversies about them. Peter, any more comments on any of that?
Three very quick points. One, adding emphasis to the discussion on reserves. This is a really important discussion. There's no right or wrong answer as to whether reserves work or not. It depends on objectives and how they've been managed and fulfilled. But I really stress taking a hard look at the discussion on reserves because that's going to be critical going forward. Second point, it's important for all of us to remember that the Northwest Forest Plan was intended to be a 100-year plan. And whether it really makes it to 100 years remains to be seen, but there's a big expectation in the original plan that it would take 100 years for some of these objectives to manifest, particularly the recruitment of old forest in areas where there was young to moderate age forest that was developing into older forest, and some of that's starting to happen and is anticipated to happen over the next 20, 50, 75 years. The third point I wanted to make is, we were careful from the beginning and throughout the writing of this document to not make recommendations for managers, although we got lots of questions from managers that were very much on the point of, what would you do if you had this situation or that situation? And, from the research point of view, that's not our call. So we tried to illuminate the issues as best we can and all the different points of view that may exist around particular issues without actually telling managers what they should be doing. That's the manager's job, not researchers, and we were careful to not cross that line. Having said that, I'm sure there'll be questions going forward from the bioregional assessment team and others to kind of get more inside the head of the authors, and I'm sure that those kinds of informal discussions can happen as we go forward. So don't be bashful about asking questions of the authors and digging down deep into what was presented, but just keep in mind it was clearly stated from the beginning from both the management and the research side that this document would not make recommendations. So we took it as far as we thought was appropriate and then left it there.
Yeah, that's an important point. I mean, unlike FEMAT, where the scientists came up with the alternatives and the administration chose something and did the assessment of the alternatives, we didn't go that route at all. It was a more limited route and I think more appropriate route given what our charge was.
Okay, with that, we were pretty much on right